In this lesson, we're going to be creating a Flask blueprint. Blueprints are a method of organizing application logic into pluggable components. So far in this series, all of our application logic has been housed in a single application file. This has worked well so far, simply because we have our one view, not a lot of logic, no models, no templates, nothing like that. But as we grow our application, if all the code is housed within our one init file, you can see how that would start to become a little bit unwieldy. So part of today's modern application architecture is creating modular components, reusable components within your application. So if you're not sure what this means, it means that when you create some type of application logic, it should be self-contained to the point where you should be able to plug that into any other application, and for the most part, it should work. Now, keep in mind, often components for applications will have dependencies that are other components, so we won't be 100% isolated when we create our own components, but this is just a typical pattern within this type of application framework. So let's get started. The first thing that we need to do is create a view file. So within our app folder, we're going to go new file, and we're going to create one called views.py. Now in this views file is where we're going to house our application views. So similar to our hello world view that we created earlier, we'll just keep that within here. But it's also where we're going to define our blueprint. So first we're going to import the blueprint class from Flask. So we'll go from Flask import blueprint. And then we're going to go down 2 lines. And now we're going to define our blueprint. So what we'll do is we'll create a variable. We'll call it reminders. And we'll make it equal to, now we're going to instantiate a blueprint object using the blueprint class. So you call it the class like this. Now blueprints take a couple of parameters. The first one is going to be our blueprint ID. So we're going to call that reminders. And then the second parameter is our file name. And then we want to we want to define a parameter for the templates folder. So it goes template underscore folder. And we want to make this equal to where we're going to house the templates for this blueprint, which is for us is going to be the templates directory that we created. Now that we have our blueprint object created, we can register views against this blueprint the same way that we are registering our views against our application. So we'll go over to our init file, and let's lift this existing view, and we'll copy or cut it out rather. And then we'll go back over to our views and we'll paste it in here. Now you see my linter is already complaining. It says undefined name app. Obviously we don't have an app object in here anymore, but what we do have is our reminders object. So we're going to change this out for reminders, and you can see that looks to be good. So this is just moving it over from the application to the blueprint, and then what we'll do is we'll plug the blueprint into our application. And that's the basics of how blueprints work. So that's what we'll do next. We'll go over to our init file. So we want to do 2 things. We want to import our blueprint from the views file, and we want to register that blueprint with our application. So what we need to do first is we need to import our blueprint object. So we'll go from .views import reminders. So what I'm doing here is I'm using relative imports from Python. If you're not familiar with relative imports, just pause now and do a quick read up on it, maybe just a refresher. So now we can register our blueprint object. So we'll go down to our register blueprints function that we stubbed out previously. You can get rid of the empty return. And then what we're going to do is we'll take the application object and we'll call a method off of it. We'll call the method register blueprint. And then we're going to pass it the reminders blueprint object. So we'll go reminders. Okay, and there we go. So that'll register our blueprint with the application, so that when the application is instantiated, we have that blueprint tied into it. So let's test that this is working. We'll go to our shell, and you can see I've already activated my virtual environment and I'm in the project directory. And we want to run Flask. So we know how to do that like we had mentioned previously. So we go Flask run, and your host, you want to bind it to the 0.0.0 and then hit enter. So you can see our app is running and it's awaiting connections. So let's switch over to a Chrome tab, and we'll put in our, one second, there we go. And we'll put in our IP address followed by port 5000. And you can see hello world. So our blueprint has been wired up properly. We've received the hello world view response, and we're good to go. Now moving back over to our code, you can see that we've kind of abstracted that view out of our initial application file, and we've moved it to our views file. And although it doesn't look like we've moved a lot of logic around, you have to keep in mind that applications consist of, potentially hundreds of views, and some of these views can be, a couple, maybe 50 lines long or something like that. So moving views into their own blueprint is a really good way of organizing your project. It makes it modular, it makes it clean, and it's just a really nice pattern to follow when you're creating applications. Now, if our project was a little bit bigger, what we would be doing is within our application directory, we would be creating new directories like reminders. So we would create application directories, and within these application directories, this is where we would house our views. So we would go views.py within the application, or rather within the reminders, and then this is where we would house our blueprints, and in these application folders you could have a dozen of them, one for users, one for reminders, one for authentication. So that's sort of the approach that you would take to creating a much larger Flask application. Now our application isn't going to be as big, and it doesn't really require that type of organization, but keep that in mind when you're going to be working with likely larger Flask projects in the future. Now, before we sign off, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a Git repository, and I'm going to save my progress within that Git repository. This is an optional exercise. I'm doing it because I need to save the progress of the project for you guys so that you can check out the code later. But it's also a really good idea to get used to using version control if you don't already. And if you do already and you're used to it, you can skip this part. Otherwise, stick around and check it out. So first we'll move over to our shell, and then we're going to shut down our server with Control-C. And I'm just going to clear this to keep things clean. So the first step that we need to take is to create a Git repository. So we'll go git init within our reminders directory. So you'll see that initialized a Git repository. So I like to do a git status just to see where things are at. And you can see these are the files that have yet to be committed. Our app folder, our run.py file, and then right here you'll see that our PyCache folder, which is our Python cache folder, has been recognized by Git, which is something that we don't want. So the next step is we're going to create a git ignore file. So we'll switch over to our code. And then within the reminders directory, we'll create a new file. We'll call it .gitignore, and make sure it's spelled right. There we go. .gitignore. And then within this .gitignore file, we're going to put in the types of files that we don't want recognized by Git. Now I have a stock template for this, or not a template, but like a stock version of this. And you can simply just Google Python git ignore, and you'll get a bunch of versions that you can use for it. So you can see there, I've added all kinds of stuff that we don't want it to recognize. These are just typical files and folders that come with Python projects. So hit save. And then we're going to switch back over to our shell. And we're going to create our first git commit. So to do that, we need to stage our files. So I'll check again, just make sure that the caching file is no longer recognized. Yeah, there you go. So you can see it's no longer there, but our git ignore file is, which is good. So now we want to add all of our files and stage them to be committed. So you use the git command git add, and if you add a dash capital A, it'll say add all the files. And I believe it also includes removing old files, or deleted files rather, and we want to say in this directory. So then we do git status, and you can see all the files within our directory, our project directory that we've created, are green, which means they're all staged to be committed. So the next step is to actually commit it. So we'll go git commit -m. -m is for message. Typically you want to have like a fairly good message describing what your commit includes. So I'm going to do, let's see, we'll go basic application structure and blueprint. Okay, so this is asking us to set up our username and email, which is something that I forgot to do previously, but that's fine, we can do it now. So we'll go git config global user.email, and we'll set it to colin.morgan@fullbit.ca. And then we'll go git config global user.name. My name is Colin Morgan, and obviously put in your own information. So let's try that again. We'll go up a couple, and we'll get our git commit basic application structure and blueprint, and we'll hit enter. And there you go. You can see it added all of our changes. And if we go git status, it says nothing to commit, working directory clean. So that means we've committed all of our changes so far to one commit, which is, if you go git log -1, you can see the commit that we just created, basic application structure and blueprint. So there you go. That's creating a Git repository for our project and just saving our progress thus far. So that's it for this lesson. In our next lesson, we're going to be creating our first template, and we're going to be adding Bootstrap to that template.